Welcome to part two of the American Revolutionary Era, where we talk about the causes and some of the effects, mostly the causes, about the American Revolution. So we left off with the third huge consequence of the French and Indian War at the end of part one, which dealt with this whole idea of greater colonial unity, starting with the French and Indian War and continuing long after that up until the point of revolution. The fourth, and probably the most important consequence of the French and Indian War, is that Britain found itself in huge debt after the French and Indian War. The amount of resources that were used to fight that war in terms of the Navy, the Army, the amount of money that was necessary to make loans to finance the war, put the British government into huge debt. So because the colonies cost so much money to be able to protect, and since a whole lot of the war was fought, over the colonies, Parliament understandably wanted the colonists to help repay the debt. In addition to the fact that most of this war was fought in the colonies, the people who benefited most from the outcome of the war with the English victory were the colonists. So this was the Parliament's sort of thinking when they came out with their new plan to raise a lot of their revenue to finance the war from the colonies. So as a result, Britain's efforts to raise tax revenue from the colonies would completely undo the entire idea of salutary neglect, which had been going on for over 100 years. So 3 generations. Colonists had really known nothing but salutary neglect previously, and then Britain now has to pay for the war, and they will begin to restrict and begin to raise taxes and try to control the colonies way more than they ever had. So one of these attempts to raise revenue was the Syugar Act, which was passed, within a year after the end of the French and Indian War. What's interesting about the Syugar Act is it actually reduced the tax on sugar, but what it did is it increased enforcement against smuggling, which the British government had been really ignoring, kind of looking the other way. But the act gave the British government much more power to restrict smuggling and to make efforts to completely stamp it out. So the colonists' reaction to this were, some of them were upset about the economic impact of the tax, especially merchants who were living in Boston, even though the tax, in fact, was lower. But the principle was that any kind of control was even being tried by England. So the merchants basically thought, okay, this might reduce the tax, but it is a new attempt at the British Parliament to try to control us. They became very angry. As a result, some merchants actually completely stopped importing British goods, effectively a boycott. There was so much of a hue and cry, such a protest against it, not a physical protest, but there was so much in terms of letters being sent and complaints to Parliament that Parliament actually repealed the Syugar Act about 2 years later. So this is actually an example of the English government backing down as a result of one of its laws that it passes. Another one was the Stamp Act. This was in 1765. And again, so this is during the same period of time the Syugar Act is in effect. What the Stamp Act did is it required colonists to pay for an official stamp on every printed and published paper. So every single piece of media that was created in the colonies, a stamp would be required, and it would cost a certain amount of money to stamp it. So this included newspapers, books, handouts like pamphlets, any court documents, legal or business contracts, playing cards, even down to dice. So understandably, again, after 100 years of not having a lot of restriction, all of a sudden something like the Stamp Act is going to create a lot of opposition in the colonies and a lot of anger. So their reactions to the Stamp Act were very different than those of the Syugar Act. So a group of colonists called the Sons of Liberty actually united to protest the tax, like physically. And their slogan became "No taxation without representation." So the reason why that they came up with a slogan was because the colonists could send no representatives to Parliament to even, short of like being able to vote in Parliament, even being able to go to Parliament and say, this is what our issues are. This is what this new regulation is doing to us. This is how it's making us feel. This is also how it's affecting our businesses. So they, like a lot of other colonists, were very angry about this. And so they came up with the slogan, we are not going to pay taxes unless we have some kind of representation in Parliament. So they felt it was their violation of their rights as English people to be taxed without any kind of representation in government, in this case, Parliament. And this idea upset them more than any kind of money that they might lose as a result of taxes. In addition to that, there was a very important organization called the Stamp Act Congress, and this Congress were elected by people living in the colonies as representatives. So the Stamp Act Congress was really the first time that representatives from each of the colonies got together, in this particular case, to focus on the injustice of the Stamp Act and the different ways they could protest to try to get England to repeal the Stamp Act. So within a pretty short period of time after that is the Boston Massacre. Now, it's known to Americans as the Boston Massacre, but it should be noted that this was also known as the incident on King Hill by the British. So obviously there are very different interpretations of what happened. There are many there's a lot of witness testimony, but still it is not clear exactly what happened. What we do know is that British soldiers fired on a mob in downtown Boston who were throwing ice and snowballs at the troops. The soldiers actually killed 5 civilians and they injured 6 others. The soldiers went on trial for murder. All but 2 were acquitted, so all but 2 were, found not guilty. It should be noted that a future president and a founding father, John Adams, was the defense attorney for the British troops, which kind of sets up a precedent for the Adams family, just 1D, for defending the underdog. So more on that later in some other screencasts. So this incident raised tensions in a Boston that was already tense over the fact that these taxes had been passed, that more troops were being sent to Boston to quote unquote keep order. And the people living in the colonies who'd been so used to salutary neglect were now looking around Boston, and it was really starting to look like an armed camp. As you can see here, you've got 2 very different versions of the event. The one on the right is the famous woodcut engraving that Paul Revere created. Here you can see the British soldiers standing in a line and firing into the crowd. It's at least in this depiction, it's very clear that the British troops are on the right-hand side and all the colonists are on the other side. None of them are armed. Most of them are on the ground. And here the British, brutally massacring these colonists. The painting on the left-hand side came out a bit later. It came out after the American Revolution had started, and you see a little bit more of the crowd on the left-hand side here starting to mix it up. Like one is holding what looks like a stick here, and so you have a depiction that at least later actually shows the British troops and the colonists kind of mixing it up, as opposed to the very, very starkly different, British on the right, colonists on the left depiction of the event. So an interesting perspective on how our interpretation of history changes over time. So that's the Boston Massacre. So within 3 years after that, the Boston Tea Party. So Boston, definitely a hotbed of colonial protest, one of the biggest cities in the colonies at this point, a very, very important place, not just for economics and the buying and selling of goods and services, but the conversation and the protests around ideas, about government, about economics, and about independence. So the Sons of Liberty, who had gotten started with their pranks and their protests, trying to get rid of the Stamp Act, also now turn their attention to the Tea Act, which was meant to actually force colonists to buy British tea rather than any smuggled tea, which was a little bit cheaper. So the demonstrators disguised themselves as Native Americans and dumped 3 ships worth of tea, equal to about $4 million today, into Boston Harbor over a period of maybe 6 hours. So this is a huge economic hit that the British companies that are trying to sell the tea are going to take. Even if they have insurance, it's going to be expensive to replace it. What's more important, though, is the idea that it's not in broad daylight, but this is clearly open, physical protest, total flaunting of the law that's happening in Boston. Parliament hears about it, and they respond very harshly by passing what are called the Coercive Acts. These are also known as the Intolerable Acts. They're passed within a year after the Boston Tea Party. They're passed in 1774. These basically are real. They're just, in fact, punishments in response to the Boston Tea Party. Again, they're called the Coercive Acts by the British, but the Intolerable Acts by the Patriots. So obviously, there's a difference of perspective on that. So the Act's major components were that they took away Massachusetts self-government. So their whole ability, the over 100 years that Massachusetts had been creating its own government, were taken away in the stroke of a pen. It closed the port of Boston completely, and then it allowed royal officials to be tried outside of Massachusetts. So the court system, which had been established in Massachusetts, was, was basically struck down because, Massachusetts self-government went away. And so all courts, all people who had been accused of crimes, who were royal officials or were coming up for trial, would be tried outside of Massachusetts. In addition to that, it required colonists to actually house British soldiers because so many more troops were being sent to, bring security to Boston. Barracks apparently could not be built fast enough, so people were forced to actually house British troops in their own home. Beginning of the Revolutionary War. So in 1774, a group of patriots had formed an illegal government called the Massachusetts Provincial Congress for the pretty much express purpose of raising and training military to fight the British. So the British found out about this, and they sent 700 troops to confiscate, to take away the militia supplies, and conquered Massachusetts. So some of the militia met the British troops in Lexington, Massachusetts, where there was an exchange of fire. The militia were far outnumbered by the British and retreated very quickly. They then rallied in Concord. The militia rallied in Concord, much larger numbers, and with their smaller force, drove the British back to Boston. So these were known as the Battles of Lexington and Concord. They were on April 19th in 1775. They were on the same day, and these were the first military engagements of the Revolutionary War. So the American Revolution began on April 19th, 1775. Even though you could also say it started in 1774 because of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. Both answers would be correct. So, Declaration of Independence. So, after more than a year of fighting, the Continental Congress voted to declare independence from Great Britain on July 2nd, 1776. The Continental Congress was, for the most part, a new version of the Stamp Act Congress. A lot of the same representatives were there, including many of the founding fathers. On July 4th, 1776, this Congress approved and signed the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration basically said that the U.S. was now the 13 colonies, now U.S. states, were justified for independence by claiming natural rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness based on Enlightenment ideals of John Locke, claiming a legal right to alter or abolish a destructive government, in this case the British government over the colonies, and giving a long list of grievances against King George III, the quartering of troops, forcing the colonies into actually using slavery for their economic system. The list goes on and on. As a matter of fact, the Declaration of Independence is mostly complaints about the way that the British government has been treating the colonists. And that, or I should say those, are all of the different causes of the American War for Independence. Thank you for listening and watching.